Hey guys, what's going on? Valky here. Today, Smaugate dropped the first balance patch of 2025 on us, and I'm gonna be honest, guys, this one is a bit of a doozy. And you guys will see in a second what I mean. Now, if you are really lazy like me, you don't want to watch the entire video, I'll put the TLDW in front. This is not going to be a patch that changes the game, changes how the game is played, because I think it interacts with a very small portion of probably the top 5 best teams. You could watch that one in the last video. I may or may not remember to have that one linked, but let's get right into it. You'll see what I mean when I say there's a lot of interesting changes and it gives you interesting toys, but it's not going to move the power level of the game. So starting off with the Fallen Cecilia buff, this is the one everybody asked for, and this is also the one that I think has the most potential, but I am also the most unsure about it. They increased her damage across the board, her max HP went up by 10%, and also they increased her barrier. On top of all of that, her ultimate now dispels all buffs before use and cannot trigger counterattack. I think that's pretty standard. But the most interesting change so far is that she is now the second 5-star speed imprint unit in the game. They have not done this since Green Vildred at the start of the game. This might not look significant, but it's very important to remember 2 speed at high level usually, and I mean usually, matters a lot, especially if you think about the context of racing. You're going up against Green Sid, you're going up against Wanderer Silk. Having a Fallen Cecilia there generally just means, you know, your unit might just be Green Sid proof now. And I think this is the one I was really having a hard time putting things on, right? I think there's potential here because, well, damage got increased across the board, barrier is more HP for her as well. Usually in games, when developers buff everything about a unit, they can't help but become strong. Like, they usually become terrorists in the game without being able to help it. But the issue is, she still dies to Death Dealer Ray. Now, one of my guildmates, STG, shout outs to my boy STG, had a really good take on this. You know, he says, hey, what if you first pick this? Let's say all the OP units are banned. You first pick her, if they race you, they're down an imprint, and then you can kill them. If they slow down, they go turn 2, then they have to play turn 2 versus an FCC. Like, I actually think that's a pretty good take, but here's the problem. I do think she's pretty strong in a lot of race scenarios, like speed versus speed, but when you have to fight stuff like Empyrean Ilanav, when you have to fight more Death Dealer Ray, God forbid, I don't really think she does anything. So whether or not she's going to be there remains to be seen, but I'm going to be trying her out day 1, and I think the new build for her will probably be pretty fast because at the very least, it seems like this is a character where Peyra is supposed to go, Fallen Cecilia goes, she strips all the buffs off of the enemy team, puts up a little bit of insulation via the skill nullifiers, and you're really sticky. And we'll talk about more as we go along. Second one, Remnant Violet. This one's really simple. Damage increased, cooldown decreased, and on top of all of that, his ultimate now gives him 50 combat readiness. This is a clear Lone Wolf Peyra synergy. Now, with Lone Wolf Peyra's swift attack buff, he's just going to be able to extra turn himself, get him a lot of value. Is this going to make him really OP? No, because Sea Phantom Politis exists, so he's not going to ever have a really easy time getting those stacks and then snowballing the game out of control, right? You play Remnant Violet, you know. That first S3, he feels about even to low tempo on a unit, but when he gets that extra attack with the second ultimate, he starts to feel like he's a real boy. Now, I think the thing that could get kind of ridiculous is you could play Fallen Cecilia, Lone Wolf Peyra, and Remnant Violet together, and you kind of have like almost like an old standard team of a tank, support, and a DPS. And they all kind of synergize pretty well with each other. It's almost like they're indirectly trying to make a Sea Phantom Politis line, you know, just without the Enraged synergy, right? These are just dark units, mono dark, a lot of synergy, combat readiness, push out the wazoo. You got FCC with infinite mitigation. Here's the problem, still died to Death Dealer Ray. Not too sure if this is going to be good into Young Senya. I do think Remnant Violet has a spot in that, you know, Young Senya matchup, but not so good into Albedo, so that one I'm not too hot on. But I do see what they're going for with this one, and it's decently interesting. This is probably the one I'm most excited about. I always like playing Red and Violet. I don't know about you guys. So yeah, that's our ML units for this batch. Next up is Lilias. They moved all of her critical hit chance into the passive, which I think is a nerf, by the way. I'm not sure why they did this. Maybe it's just to save space, you know, so this line doesn't have to appear twice on 2 skills and you just be here. But I think now, like, if she gets sealed, it's a really bad look. But here's the buff, though. So now, whenever she uses her extra skill, the non-attacking one, it dispels all buffs from her. So this lowers her ability to be outplayed, because before it only dispelled 1, now it dispels all. And I think as long as the enemy is using non-attack skills, it'll keep dispelling all. This is probably the only change in this patch that I think actually interacts with Death Dealer Ray. And I think what's very important here is this line. When the target is provoked through her S2, now damage increases. This is important for 2 reasons. One, I think they're trying to make her the default answer to a lot of the non-attacking supports we've gotten recently. ML Peyra, ML Lua. Not so much ML Luna, I don't think that's a good matchup for her, but Sea Phantom Politis as well. So if the enemy is provoked and the damage is increased by like a significant margin, right? Like if you think about 50 or 75 or maybe even double damage for somebody who's provoked, this actually means you'd be able to play some combo drafts with her where, let's say you go ML Lua on 3rd pick Ban Protect, and they have a character that's going to like cleanse, then you'd be able to just drop Fire Lilias and they can combo together. So if they cleanse, you're at least getting damage in on one character and they get the cut. And if they don't, then your Red Lilias might just obliterate their entire team. So it really depends on what the damage increase is. That is usually the hardest part about evaluating these, is when you don't know how much damage there is. Like, for example, Fallen Cecilia also got damage increase. And oh yeah, I forgot to mention, her Soulburn ignores ER. This is definitely the one where I'm like the most lost on, because I'm not sure who this is made for. I think I saw Elvmage say you can always use this, Soulburn it into Amiki. That's a really good matchup. But if you think about all the other good characters, right? Blood Moon Haze usually gets immunity when you trigger him. Dragon Brysenia gets debuff immunity, so you can't even set up that combo as well. Yeah, so I think the effectiveness of Lilias kind of up in the air, but now one of her EEs also give her immunity for 2 turns. So I think she's going to be a alright utility bruiser. They did put her a bit more into the spotlight. But I think most of the time she works, it'll be predicated on whether or not your opponent has speed tuning. Because if you're speed tuned very well as an aggro player or a cleaver, you never let a Red Lilias cut you, right? I'm not crazy in thinking that. So in that sense, I think she'll maybe be a really good noob stomper. Diene is another really interesting buff. So what they did was they swapped her cleanse to the S3. Now it dispels all debuffs, which is good. I think that's a really necessary part of skills in 2025. There's so many debuffs in the game now, and it's such an important part of the metagame that you definitely want to dispel all. Dispelling like 2 almost feels kind of low. They moved her attack buff to the S2. So now it's less turns. I think it used to be like 3 turns, right? Yeah. Attack buff for 3 turns. Now it's 2 turns, but it's also on a lower cooldown because the S2 is very low cooldown. But the most interesting buff they gave her was the increased penetration resistance. And the buff will basically give every unit a Empyrean Illinav passive or a Wukong passive. Just think about it like that. I don't think this is a good buff. Here's the problem. Yes, Empyrean Illinav is OP, but that's a part of a passive, right? It comes in the moment you're in the game. So without taking a turn, she's really good against cleave when your opponent has damage penetration. Diene needs to be taking a turn. So getting that turn versus any aggressive compositions is already a tough task. And then she has to press, which means okay, now you have to risk triggering into a green Celine. Now you have to think about whether or not this is a risk into Politis. Does the buff get stripped via a Blood Moon Haze? Or heck, even Fallen Cecilia can strip all buffs now. And that's all things you have to consider. This also means versus fast compositions, she kind of gets run over. Versus the slower compositions, well, now you have to play against Alencia Young Senya. And I just am not convinced this makes for a strong character. I do think this is interesting, at least versus Empyrean Illinav players before. If you guys think about how a draft works out, the Empyrean Illinav player would take her first pick and then be able to pick all the defense penetration units as normal, whereas the other players just kind of stuck there twiddling their dick, right? So now it kind of equalizes that. I think if you're playing versus Empyrean Illinav aggro flex, this is kind of an okay buff, even though you're kind of weak to being stripped. But otherwise, I don't think it changes the game too much. It seems really good, right? And you know what? I think one important distinction to be making here is that when I look at this, because the game mode I play the most, if you guys look at the name of the channel, is actually RTA. I think this is not that good of a change in RTA. But in Arena and Guild War, where you can pick and choose your matchups, and you know your opponent doesn't have buff strip, you know your opponent can't cleave you, I think this is not too bad. Like, if you have at the end, you're an older player, this is an okay change. I think that's all I'll say for it. Actually, in fact, I think this might even trend a little bit stronger. But in RTA, when your opponent can counterplay you, I think this is trending a bit on the weaker side. After that is Krau. So now when his skill is available according to cooldown, so as long as his ultimate is up, he now transfers 25% of the damage suffered by allies in their place. So now he gets Aureus for free. That is big. When he horses somebody, he heals a little bit. And the most cool part, I think, about this whole thing is it now decreases his damage dealt if you soul burn, but it hits an AoE. And oh yeah, his EE lowers his cooldown by a turn, right? So that to me is really interesting. So that tells me this entire patch is meant to balance around Lone Wolf Peyra, because Lone Wolf Peyra is a aggro enabler where she generates your team so many turns, but she doesn't do this thing that a lot of cleave and aggro units have been doing for the past 2 years, which is drop a lot of debuff. If you think about Sea Phantom Politis, Luna, Lua, yada yada, right? All of those units drop a pretty noticeable amount of debuff, whereas Peyra doesn't do that, but enables your team to be taking turn after turn after turn. So Krau, as far as I can see, is just there to absorb a lot of the damage and then maybe soul burn into an AoE, right? Like, you think about using him to tank down versus ML Peyra, Fallen Cecilia, Remnant Violet, and then you come back and you just soul burn the S3, you know, provided you clear the skill nullifiers. Soul burn the S3 even with decreased damage dealt. I would imagine you would one-shot the Remnant Violet, maybe kill the Peyra, and if there's another squishy unit there, they're probably gone too, like Afternoon Soak Flan. But here's the problem. Number one, you're still really weak to DDR. You're still really weak to Young Senya, Alencia, and to some degree maybe even more, maybe not more, right? He's just not very good versus half of what makes the game important, right? He's not very good versus Illinav because, you know, he's predicated on defense penetration. So versus the aggro compositions, he's not good versus the debuff ones. He's not good when the other guy is playing Requiem Roanin and it resets his cooldown. He is good if all they do is take damage characters and he's just there to mitigate the damage. But if you have to slow down into Illinav, into any green compositions with Young Senya, not very good. After that is Ludwig. This is another default ML Peyra buff. Just guarantee some 50% combat readiness so that if he catches a swift attack buff, he's immediately taking another turn. This is countered by any kind of combat readiness chokehold like Ret Politis and Abyssal Euphine, so I don't think he'll see too much play, but you know, if you're playing against Lone Wolf Peyra, this might be something you see. especially if they're going to be giving his S2 a self-attack buff, which Peyra doesn't give, or a defense break. So there is a little bit of potential, but the fact that he's still very predicated on needing that combat readiness to pop off, I'm not big on, right? Because you guys can imagine, you sit there in your invincibility and you're just waiting to take your turn. You can easily get your turn interrupted, right? Whereas if you're playing a Remnant Violet, now he just hits some dude really hard, gets combat readiness, and if he doesn't, hey, at least he's sitting there with, what, 70, 80, 90% evasion with Rampage as well. So I think that's a slightly more attractive and a safer way to play the game than just sitting there waiting for your turn to come up, maybe so you can take advantage of that defense break. I'm not convinced that one is too good. Ventura Ross, really simple. They're just kind of buffing his damage across the board. AoE defense buff, and also they're bumping his defense break up to 85% from 60. I don't know if this matters that much. Oh yeah, I guess Solitude Rune is also being buffed to 3 turns, so he's going to be able to protect his back unit a lot better. This is at the very least a good PvE buff. I'm not convinced about it in PvP, just because I don't think Adventurer Ross does enough in 2025. I know there are high-ranked players that really like him, but overall, you know, they could have made this 100%, and, you know, it seems alright. AoE defense buff might provide some potential, though. We're gonna have to see. Down to the artifacts, this one's really simple. Wings is what we call a stat stick. It's literally any other damage knight artifact, like Mature Sunglasses, or if you think about even Yulha's artifact, like it's just there to give you some stats, boost your damage. The damage went from 20% to 14 to 22%. It's not even that much of a buff. It just makes sure that your first hit is getting like 2/3 of your value. That's really it. It's just another stat stick. And of course, finally, here's the final ML Peyra buff. Uberius Tooth now goes off of AoEs. I think one thing people have noticed is if you're playing ML Peyra, Sweet Miracle is useless like 90% of the times until it's useful. But those 10% of the times where you play against the ML Lua, where you play against the ML Luna, God forbid you let her through the draft, you really need the Sweet Miracle. So I don't think for RTA it's very good, but for Arena and for Guild War, I actually think this is like a pretty good replacement. This is going to be, especially if you're on a attack speed Peyra setup, this is going to be letting you hit turn after turn, especially if you have Soulburn and you're hitting 4 dudes after you stacked up your attack. I'd imagine this isn't going to hit super hard, but it's going to be enough where it'll let Peyra close out some games, because that's something that I've noticed she kind of lacks. Now, Blue Peyra is a known roper, right? She's cleaves you, and even if you somehow defend against her cleave, if you're left in a 1v1 scenario, she's going to Soulburn her stun turn after turn, and she could still win games that way. ML Peyra kind of lacks that because her damage is really, really subpar. Uberius' Tooth has pretty good scaling, so once she's fully stacked up on her passive, it might give her enough of a POW to end games. I don't think this is going to be the default artifact for RTA. Some people are probably going to tech it in, but I think for Arena and Guild War, where you can pick and choose your fights, this will be a pretty okay option. Either way, that is the entire patch, my thoughts on it. Let me know what you guys think. I think ultimately, this is not going to be a patch that changed the game, which is I think what most people are looking for. But it does give you a lot of interesting toys, right? You can't say this is like the worst patch ever, because it certainly isn't. I think it does a couple of things to address certain problematic units. Like, I think some of these buffs are pretty good versus like BBK, for example, and Afternoon Soak Flan. But it doesn't really address the rest of the game. It doesn't, you know, hold back like Empyrean Illanav. It doesn't fight back against the power level of Senya Albedo or Senya Alencia. Surprisingly, those units have turned out to be way too strong after a Lifton, KHM, and Light kind of really refined that draft. In any case, let me know what you guys think down below. I'll see you guys in the next video. We're probably going to make a Lone Wolf Para showcase and guide as soon as possible, whenever everybody comes back from Chinese New Year vacation. But that's going to be it from me for today. Have a great one. Stay safe out there. I'll see you guys in the next video. See ya.